Good evening. I'm Greg Nerland, a member of the board of the Walnut Creek Library Foundation, and I'd like to welcome you to our virtual Live from the Library program, Scary Technology, Cybersecurity, and Thrillers, with author and attorney Reece Hirsch and author Terry Shames. I'd first like to thank our print sponsors, East Bay Times and Minuteman Press Lafayette. Reece is a Walnut Creek resident. He's a partner in an international law firm and is co-chair of its privacy and security practice. He also serves on the board of the Valentino Achak Deng Foundation, which provides educational opportunities to youth in South Sudan. Reece's first book, The Insider, was a finalist for the International Thriller Writers Award for Best First Novel. His latest series, which includes Black Nowhere and Dark Tomorrow, features FBI cybercrime investigator Lisa Tanchik. His three prior books, The Adversary, Intrusion, and Surveillance, all feature former Department of Justice cybercrime prosecutor Chris Bruin. Reece will be in conversation with Terry Shames, author of the award-winning best-selling Samuel Craddock mystery novels. Her recent book is A Risky Undertaking for Loretta Singletary, and she is currently putting the finishing touches on the 9th book in the series. We'll get to hear how Reece turns real-world issues like cybersecurity and privacy into thrillers. If you enjoyed tonight's program, consider making a donation to the Library Foundation to support our programs. Visit our website, www.wclibrary.org, to donate, or click on the link located in the chat box. I will be matching gifts up to $250 tonight. Following Reece and Terry's conversation, we will have a brief Q&A. You can submit your questions in the Q&A box at any time. Without further ado, please join me in welcoming Reece Hirsch and Terry Shames.
Thank you for joining us. And thank you, Greg. And thank you to the Walnut Creek Library for arranging this event. I'm happy to be here with my good friend Reece Hirsch. I wish we were here in person, but an event like this allows us to be more, to have more people. So I'm happy for us to be doing this. I myself write plain old mystery novels, and if I was smart enough, I would write thrillers like Reece does. But I love an intelligent, well-written thriller, especially one that doesn't do action just for the sake of action. And I have to tell you that Reece is right up there with my favorites, and I have read every one of his books and enjoyed them. Reece, I'm going to start out by asking you some general questions and then get to the specifics of your latest book, Dark Tomorrows. So let's start off by asking something that, as long as I've known you, I think I've never asked you, and that is, why would a high-powered lawyer suddenly decide they want to become a thriller writer? Tell us about that.
Well, I started out as somebody who always wanted to be a writer and then ended up being a lawyer. So I was actually a journalist and got a journalism degree from Northwestern University, and actually edited and published a free arts and entertainment magazine in Atlanta for a few years before I went to law school. So writing was always something that I wanted to do, but it seemed kind of daunting writing a novel at first. It took me a while to sort of get my act together. And finally, when I was a associate billing tons of hours trying to make it in the law firm, I didn't find the time. But after I made partner, I resolved to sit down and finish a book. And that's when I got started. A little late, but better late than never.
Your readers are very glad that you did. So the vein of the question that writers get often asked, that is sort of the bane of their questions, is, where do you get your ideas? But where do you get your ideas? Is it from your job as an attorney, as a cybersecurity attorney, or do you go hunting for ideas, or do they come to you sort of unbidden?
They arise pretty naturally out of my law practice, because I'm a privacy and cybersecurity attorney. That means on a daily basis, I'm advising companies that have been victimized by hackers and cyber criminals and have experienced massive security breaches. And also, I advise a lot of the largest companies on how they collect and use your personal information. And that includes you, Terry.
Oh, thanks.
And everyone listening to this, there are companies that have developed very robust profiles on all of us. And I try to tell them what they can and can't do. And that in itself can be a little bit of a scary concept. So I take these ideas that come out of my legal practice, and then I give it a body count, basically. I think about it.
Good.
With any new technology I'm working with, my first thought as a thriller writer is, how can I kill someone with this?
Have you ever, when you have an idea like this, have you ever felt the need to pass it by one of your partners or something in case you are crossing the line? I know that some thriller writers who write about things in, say, the CIA or the FBI sometimes have to get vetted by those people to find out if they're somehow delving into something they shouldn't. Have you ever had to do that?
I haven't had to do that because I deal in concepts that come from my law practice, but I'm careful not to portray a particular client incident. And kind of in the nature of thrillers, everything's a little bit heightened. So, like for example, as a privacy attorney, I've never carried a gun, I've never seen a dead body. But if you've read my Chris Bruin series, you would think that being a privacy attorney is the world's most dangerous profession, because that's just the way thrillers are. You tend to kick it up a notch or two. And so that keeps me away from kind of the details of client relationships.
Talking about that Chris Bruin series, I still remember the first scene from that first Chris Bruin book. So any of you who haven't read that should. What was the name of the very first one? I've forgotten.
The Adversary.
The Adversary.
And actually, you raise a good point, because that first scene in The Adversary was based on a real incident. I was giving a presentation with a fellow cybersecurity attorney, and we were going our separate ways. It was out of town. And I said, "Where are you going next?" And he said, "Oh, I'm going to Stockholm, because we're going to knock on the door of a hacker and try to get him to return intellectual property that they've stolen." And so that one actually was fairly close to a real incident. But of course, in my version of the story, somebody dies. Nobody died in the real event.
That you know of, anyway.
That I know of.
So along with this, you're a busy partner at a law firm. When do you find time to write?
Well, I used to write on the BART train, and I live in Walnut Creek, as Greg mentioned, and our offices are across from the Ferry Building in downtown San Francisco. So I had learned to take my laptop on the BART train, get a seat and try to tune out everything for 45 minutes or so, and weekend mornings. But one thing about the pandemic, it's taken away my commute. So I've got a little more time in the morning to squeeze in, a page or two before I get started on the legal work. So the one upside, maybe one of the very few upsides of the pandemic.
Really, anybody out there listening who is not a writer, you can't imagine what this means, is that Reece is able to concentrate so hard that he can get a few pages done on a BART train. I really admire that. So regarding your writing, take us from the moment you have an idea to when you start putting things down on paper. Do you outline? Do you make notes? Do you do research, or do you just splat it out there?
Well, a little bit in between, but first I'll talk about the things that inspired my last two books. Just usually there's a little kernel of an idea that gets me started. And with the first book in the Lisa Tanchik series, Black Nowhere, it was the true life story of Ross Ulbricht, who founded the Silk Road dark website. And I read some journalism about him, some of his story, and it just blew my mind. I thought it was the most fascinating story, because it was like a real life Breaking Bad, Walter White story, because it was about this young, smart, well-liked college kid who ended up starting this business online, like a lot of entrepreneurs. It's just his business happened to be an illegal drug marketplace, sort of the eBay of drugs, which were sold anonymously through the dark web. And he experienced enormous success, was making tons of money, sort of cornered a large segment of the US illegal drug trade until he was finally brought down. And what fascinated me about that when I read the story was I realized this guy is just like Silicon Valley entrepreneurs. He's like another Zuckerberg or Gates or Jobs. It's just he happened to also be a criminal kingpin. And I thought, well, you know, the one thing that journalism couldn't tell you is what was going on in his head. How did he sort of make that transition from starting this sort of somewhat well-intentioned at first sight into ordering hits on people who were threatening to compromise his criminal empire. And so that was kind of, reading that story inspired me to write the character of Nate Fallon in Black Nowhere. And in Dark Tomorrow, it also was inspired, at least the first chapter, by a real life incident involving the journalist Kurt Eichenwald, because Eichenwald was terrorized by someone who sent him an email that when you click on the attachment, it would create this brilliant strobe, blinding strobe. And if you're someone who has epilepsy, that could induce a seizure, maybe even a deadly seizure. It's called photosensitive epilepsy. And I thought that was just the most evil thing. And yet we all click on attachments every day. And so I thought that sort of formed the basis for the murder scene in chapter 1 of Dark Tomorrow. But to your process issue, you know, I don't outline, you know, copiously in enormous detail, but I do, you know where I'm going roughly. And I usually have the next 5 or 6 or 7 chapters outlined in some detail. And it's a lot like at a writer's conference, I heard the writer C.J. Box describe his process. And I said, yes, that's what I do. I'm glad somebody else does that, because he puts the outline into the manuscript and he always has a few extra chapters outlined in front of him, but then he cannibalizes the outline as he writes. And that's kind of what I do. Sort of always have a little bit of outline going for me that's right in the manuscript.
That's amazing. Yeah, that sounds very good. You know, I know that there are people who just write full on and never have any kind of outline, and I don't see how people do that. So I think that sounds like a very good good way of doing things. I'm so interested to see how these people who are doing this, these things that you're sort of taking as your outlet for your books, because I remember hearing an NPR talk one time about the fact that an inordinate number of CEOs of companies are in fact sociopaths. And I think that what you're describing is somebody who is a sociopath who's able to put aside all human feeling and just go for, you don't even know whether it's about money necessarily. It's something to do with ego and the thrill of the game. Is that right?
That's exactly right. And that's what fascinated me so much about the real life Ross Ulbricht character and the character I created, Nate Fallon, who's pretty closely modeled after Ulbricht, because you have to be an obsessive.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that he came to be so invested in this creation of his, this business, and he even put it in altruistic terms. He sort of put trappings around creating a community of users, and he was kind of their little godlike figure, and dispensing sage wisdom. And he became so addicted to that, to what he had created, and he was so proud of it that he was willing to kill to keep it together.
Wow.
So I think I wouldn't say all CEOs are sociopaths by any means, but
I don't think all.
Well, not all, but there has to be a little kernel of that kind of obsession, I think, to be a success at that level.
Yeah. Um, I get hooked on your characters right away. You write great characters. So, do the characters that you write come from people that you know, or is it just coming from your imagination? Is it anybody in particular? Has anybody ever challenged you saying, "Uh-oh, I know who that is," and were they right?
Well, I guess in my first book, which is sort of a John Grisham-esque legal thriller called The Insider, there were some villainous attorneys in that book that were, inspired a little bit by some former colleagues at another firm. But I know that even if they read the book, they wouldn't recognize themselves in it because villains never think they're the villain.
Exactly.
And that's what makes a great villain. They're the hero of their own story.
Yeah, one of the things I think is interesting about your books too is that any kind of really successful book has to have not just a really inspiring protagonist, but the antagonist, the bad guy, has to be equal to the good guy in intelligence, and you do an excellent job of that. And do you work at that, or does it just turn out that way because of is it the nature of the book that you're writing?
I hope I do it all the time, but I think that in Black Nowhere, I probably did it a little bit more than usual because I started by being so fascinated with this Ross Ulbricht, Nate Fallon character that I kind of started with him. And so I think a lot of people in their Amazon reviews and Goodreads reviews for that book often say that they kind of root for both the villain and the hero in that book. And that's what I wanted. I wanted them to really question, why they were going along for the ride with Nate Fallon on his sort of criminal enterprise, and sort of question, whether they would make the same choices if they got put in a similar position.
Oh, good question.
And hopefully, I think in Dark Tomorrow too, Natalia X is hopefully a strong, antagonist, and she's a little bit of a sociopath, but a worthy adversary for my FBI agent, Lisa Tanchik.
So, when you do these plots, have you ever had to change a plot because it was too close to reality? We'll talk a little bit more about that later, but I'm just curious if you've ever gotten too close to what you think is actually going to be real.
That is always, a dilemma when you're writing books that are so close to reality, that are inspired by some of these cutting edge developments in privacy and cybersecurity. And it turns out with Dark Tomorrow, I was cutting it pretty close. I didn't realize quite how close until the book came out, because Dark Nowhere was published, Dark Tomorrow rather, was published in May. And just recently we've learned about the big SolarWinds hack where Russia's SVR infiltrated the US government and many private businesses as well. And that is the kind of attack that I portray in Dark Tomorrow. And it had actually begun 2 months before my book came out. It's just we didn't find out about it till later in the year. But it's very close to reality. I think if people want to understand what's happening, to our federal databases, reading Dark Tomorrow gives them an idea of some of the threats.
Interesting. In my books, which are not thrillers by any means, I've had a few odd instances where I fictionalized something only to find out several months later that it actually happened. So I don't know how that happens, whether we just tap into some kind of zeitgeist or if it's just serendipity or what. Yeah. So
you just have to go with it. Oh, and I wanted to ask you a question too. And first of all, I wanted to say that for those of you who are listening here who haven't read Terry's books, they're absolutely wonderful. The Samuel Craddock series.
Thank you.
If you love Craig Johnson's Longmire books, or Bill Kreider's series with Sheriff Dan Rhodey, you're going to love Terry's book. She's got a wonderful character and a wonderful arc throughout the books. And also, it leads me into a question I wanted to ask you,
Sure.
because as you can see, a lot of my characters are very tech-savvy individuals. But in your latest book, A Risky Undertaking for Loretta Singletary, your protagonist is not tech-savvy at all, and yet he has to investigate a murder online. How did you approach dealing with these kinds of technology issues from a very different perspective in your book?
You know, I'm lucky. I have a writers group in which there's a young man who's about 36 and is very tech savvy, and I just picked his brain about it. I had read about the fact that a lot of elderly people are being targeted in some of these dating websites for older people. And I thought that was a fascinating thing. And I thought, I've never really, Loretta Singletary is a character that everyone loves. She's been through all of my books. And I thought, why don't I focus a book on her? And I thought, and quite by coincidence, in the previous book, I had her decide to start getting herself gussied up and become a little more out there in the world and maybe even date a little bit. And so it was the natural thing for her to find out about an older website, an older dating website for older people. It's called, I just made up a name, Small Town Pair, I called it. And she gets caught up in a scam. And so for Samuel, who is not particularly savvy about things, to be able to investigate this, I actually had to find out something about these dating sites, and that's where the 36-year-old man came in, because he's single, and he said, "Oh, here's how it works on those dating websites," so I didn't have to sign up for one myself. Yeah, so it was a lot of fun to do that, because I actually am tech savvy, and so it was it's always been interesting to me to sort of imagine someone who is being brought kicking and screaming into the tech world. Yeah.
Yeah, Samuel Craddock's world is it's kind of far away from high tech in Silicon Valley, but that's
Well,
a
in the
good thing.
real town that he is from, in the series is based on, it was only a few years ago that they even had any kind of cell phone coverage, so it was pretty untechy. So let's get back to talking about this. You were talking about uh, the characters and the way you set these things up, and the really interesting background of some of these stories. So let's talk a little bit about Dark Tomorrow. I think it's probably your darkest book, and I say that not as a good thing, because as a thriller writer, that's what I love. So I'm just gonna read a couple of blurbs. First of all, here's the blurb, review blurb that I wrote for it. I said, Hirsch imagines a frightening future in which cybercrime is rampant, and it takes the best and the brightest resources of the government to combat the enemy's relentless attacks. Dark Tomorrow is both terrifying and compulsively readable. And there was another review. There were so many really good reviews for the book that it was hard to choose, but I really like this one from Joe Clifford. He's the author of very intense books himself. And here's what he wrote.
Great.
Yeah, he wrote tales of deadly toxins, cyber hacking, and spy games fuel this masterclass treatment of Agent Lisa Tanchek and her adversary Natalia X, infusing their profound skill sets with unique flaws, rendering them deeply human. And I think I'm just going to say as an aside here that I think that's one of the reasons your books read so well, is that you don't have ciphers, you have actual human beings. But he goes on to say, Hirsch uses his backdrop of the dark web and deep fakes to highlight the horrors of modern life, that the thinnest of lines keeps our civilization from ruin. That's terrifying. So talk to us about Dark Tomorrow with relation to the real world.
Well, I spent a good bit of time researching Dark Tomorrow because even though I deal with scary technology issues in my practice, I don't deal with cyber warfare. That's for the government to deal with. And so I had to read books like The Perfect Weapon by David Sanger, and there's a book called Dark Territory by Fred Kaplan. There are others. And it's very, very scary what I learned, which is that cyber warfare really is here today. And there's this constant sort of, push and pull among nations online where they're, compromising electrical grids and water systems, in the guise of collecting intelligence. And fortunately, it's recognized that countries are doing this to each other, but it hasn't crossed the line into all-out warfare. For example, there may be access to the electrical grid, but another country hasn't actually shut down our power supply.
Right.
But just the other day, there was a story about a hacker that compromised the water system, water supply, or at least had the ability to do it and was threatening it in one US city. And so basically, I took the reality of this cyber warfare tension that's going on and imagined, well, what if it finally crossed the line? Something happened that caused one party to go too far. And it would be exactly like what Russia's SVR allegedly has done to the US right now. It's just right now they're using it for espionage and to collect intelligence, and they haven't actually tried to shut things down. But
not that we know of anyway.
Right, not that we know of, but in my book, they take these, this malware and these, compromises, and they shut down the electrical grid on the entire East Coast and sort of cast the country, at least the East Coast of it, into darkness. And I think some people have read that and said, kind of resonates in these pandemic times where we're all stuck at home and wondering what the world's coming to. But the reality is every bit as scary. We just haven't quite gotten there yet. And one thing I touch on in the book is that Russia, is sort of testing out these cyber warfare capabilities on Ukraine right now and in the recent years, because they're kind of a punching bag for them, and they can sort of refine their skills. And so I'm imagining, what if they finally applied what they've learned, beating up on Ukraine, to the United States? Hopefully it'll never happen, but it's going to happen someday.
Well, you say this is not happening, but I just heard a talk the other day with a couple of people who are in hospitals who are saying that routinely hospitals are being targeted with a threat to expose all the information of some of their people and to take them down. And hospitals are having to pay. And if it's a reasonable amount, like only $1 million to $2 million, sometimes they'll pay just to avoid having to rebuild their things. And one hospital said that they had decided to decline, and the threat was made good, and they were completely shut down, and it took them months to rebuild everything. So if they're doing that to hospitals, that to me crosses the line.
Yeah, and definitely. And my particular specialty in privacy law is healthcare privacy and HIPAA. So, I have dealt with those so-called ransomware incidents quite often, and it's a real sort of business model for these cyber criminals. Usually it isn't government directed in most cases. It's more people just looking to shake down businesses for money. Mm-hmm. But even just over the holidays, there was a healthcare client that I worked with that was a victim of ransomware. And they were going to choose to pay the ransom just because, a lot of these cyber criminals do sort of respect the bargain because it's essential to their business model that they, if they never release the data when they're paid, then people aren't going to pay them.
Yeah.
But in order to pay off the ransom, you have to have a Bitcoin account. And so it was over the Christmas holiday, the client didn't have a Bitcoin account.
Right. Yes.
And so they weren't able to make the payment, even though they were willing to. And so the cyber criminals said, okay, we'll make it a loan. You can pay us a week later, but we're going to charge you interest in the meantime.
I
So
know, I heard about
it's
that.
very much a business at this point.
It's very much a business. That's really just crazy. Yeah. Well, at one point, for some, I don't know, I don't remember why, but I looked into the various kinds of security companies that provide security, and a lot of companies do not want to pay for security. And I wonder why they don't. It seems foolish at this time, at this juncture, to do that.
Definitely, in my legal practice, that is the advice, that it's better to pay now and build up robust cybersecurity protections than to be compromised and have to pay ransomware or to have a major security breach, which can be so damaging to your reputation and the trust people place in you, that a little preventive medicine is a much better route. But that said, one of my books, Intrusion, deals with state-sponsored hacking, in that case by China. And even though companies need to protect their information and their assets, there's a certain point at which, if you're on the other side of a large nation with an army of hackers at their disposal and the most sophisticated technology, they will get what they want. They will be able to compromise your systems. But
in other words, the security is quite good enough, is what you're saying.
Yeah, even our own government can't fully protect itself against the most sophisticated threats, but you can at least be not the low-hanging fruit. You can make yourself so you're not an easy target.
Yeah, right. So do you worry that we're helpless against bad actors in this dark web? Is one of the things that you are set on doing, is warning people through your books?
There's a little of that, definitely. I think mainly I want to entertain and tell a good story, but I think one thing I draw on a lot in my books, it's probably a theme throughout all of them, is it's like that little stencil on the rear view mirror: objects are closer than they appear. And that's what technology is for us. It does so many great things, bringing people together, but it also brings very bad people right to your inbox, your doorstep, virtual doorstep. And so that's sort of a peculiarly modern kind of terror. And that's something I play on all the time in my books. That just,
I don't
no
know
matter who you are, you're just one click away from somebody that you don't want to know.
Exactly. I mean, I don't know why anybody would ever click on a website that they don't know. If someone sends them something and says, "Oh, we want to help you with this, click here," I say, absolutely not. I have no idea who you are and what you want. So
yes, but the cyber criminals are very sophisticated that way, and they know that. And so, like in chapter 1 of Dark Tomorrow, the criminal gets an individual, even a sophisticated person who works for US Cyber Command, to click on the attachment because it looks like it's coming from his wife with a picture of their dog. And it looks like something that he would get from his wife all the time. But if you examine the email address that's being used, there's one letter that's off. It's a fake. And they knew just what he would click on. And so often these cyber criminals do their homework. And a few years ago, or fairly recently, there was a whole series of scams where somebody would pose as the CEO of a company, and they would contact somebody in the HR department saying, I need the social security numbers of everyone in the company pronto. You know, and surprisingly, a lot of people would respond to that email because it's their boss or they think it's their boss. And then, you know, the cyber criminals are off to the races with that
Wow.
data.
So they're just really clever. That's all there is to it. Okay,
Yeah.
so here's my next question, and that is, you know, we talked about your characters, that you do a really great job with characters and about these people that you have. So how come you had had a female lead character in Lisa Tanchik, and you have also Natalia X? So what's this with the women?
Well, you know, I'd written 4 books, you know, with male protagonists.
Mhm.
And, you know, I wanted to do something, you know, stretch myself a little bit. And, you know, I thought I just had this, you know, image of this character of Lisa Tanchik, who is a little bit of a misfit in the FBI. And I think part of that being a misfit involves one being kind of a geek, you know, being very much, you know, a cybersecurity expert, but also maybe not being the typical physical square-jawed FBI agent that we're used to. So she's a fairly diminutive, not somebody who's going to throw a perp, you know, against a wall necessarily. And I thought that made, you know, her, you know, have to struggle a little bit for, you know, acceptance within the FBI.
Mhm.
And that was something that I imagined might be the case, but I was happy to know later when I got some contacts in the FBI that that is a real dynamic, actually, that it is hard for particularly these cybersecurity experts to become field agents and sort of get that kind of street cred. And I think it's also, you know, can be challenging for women FBI agents too.
And very interesting. Yeah. Okay. Well, so let me ask you this. There's another question I have. Do you have any particular advice for people about how to combat cyber hacking besides don't open the attachment?
Well, that's what I was going to say. That's a really good one. Don't open the attachment, you know, unless you know the source. And even then, look at the address that it's coming from, because usually that will be a giveaway. It may look to all appearances like something that you are familiar with, but look at exactly where it's coming from.
Mhm, mhm.
And you know, I think hire, if you're a company or even an individual, you know, who is doing a lot online, you know, hire an expert. You know, if you're running a business, you need to have real data security expertise, someone who knows their stuff, who can make sure that you're, you know, adhering to you know, industry standards. And frankly, as far as, you know, helping individuals in their account, what I tend to do is work with companies who have either experienced a big security breach or they're trying to comply with laws.
Mhm.
But I'm less involved with sort of giving out that kind of practical individual advice. But no clicking on attachments that you don't know. That's a good one.
Well, okay, let me just read something from Crime Spree magazine. We're talking about this in the real world now. So Crime Scene magazine says this novel is eerily realistic to what is happening today. In many ways, the gripping plot will cause readers to stop and think about many issues, including the need to be careful with their own privacy. So it seems to me that I'm seeing more and more apocalyptic books out there these days. I'm reading one right now that is not necessarily about cybercrime, but it's a little piece of it. It's called The End of October by Lawrence Wright. So do you think that the public is becoming one of the reasons these books are called popular now is that the public is becoming increasingly aware of the danger that malevolent hackers can do to our lives? Or do you think that there's still a lot to learn?
I think that's true, and yeah, I think people are becoming more aware of it. And sometimes I even resist the idea of being called a writer of cyber thrillers,
Mhm.
because I think that given the way technology and cybersecurity has kind of infiltrated our lives, I think that that's where crime is, sort of major crime is being conducted these days, is online. And
Mhm.
that's where espionage is occurring. So the spy novels of today really are cyber espionage books. And then similarly with Dark Tomorrow, that's where warfare, you know, is being conducted at a low level today, but eventually it's going to turn into a hot war.
Yeah.
And so I think that it's just kind of recognizing the reality that's out there. So much of our lives are conducted online now, particularly
Well,
during the pandemic,
you know,
like this.
I was thinking about this with regard to what's going on in Texas and other parts of the South right now as they've lost their power. They've lost a lot of their power, both their old power grids and their new power grids. Everything is falling away. And I just talked to my sister, and she said that they're having to boil their water now. So it almost is like a little microcosm of what's happening or what could happen if somebody, a bad actor, really did take down the entire power grid.
Right. And that's something I look at in a lot of detail in Dark Tomorrow. And it's amazing what a fine line we walk in our
Yeah.
civilization, because once you take away the electricity, things start to break down pretty quickly. And I actually saw this firsthand because my wife and I were stranded in a hotel in New York City when Hurricane Sandy hit, and that city was shut down. And we watched, sort of the stores run out of food very quickly, the restaurants run out of food, the gas stations run out of gas, and slowly, sort of things become very, very difficult because when you shut down the power, it sort of stops so many things from flowing logistically that keeps cities alive. And
Yeah.
so I kind of drew on some of that experience when I wrote those scenes about DC in the blackout
I
after
found
cyber
myself,
attack.
yeah, I found myself writing a couple of real-time notes to send through the post office in the last few days, and I thought, it would be easier just to send it across email, but it made me start thinking about the fact that we don't do all those old things anymore. It's just so much easier just to do it. And if that were to suddenly fall away, there was no internet, there was no, and we knew that it may not come back for a long time to come. There are people alive today who would have no idea how to go about they I mean, I watched Schitt's Creek recently. I'm, one of the ones that, and in this, someone gives one of the characters some stamps, and she says, "Oh, look, it's pictures of little bitty men." She doesn't know what a stamp is because she's never had to use one. And so I'm thinking there are people who would be really, really, especially young people, who would not have the slightest idea what to do. So we both include current events in our fiction. In general, do you think it's important for writers? We're moving back from specifics now to the general. Do you think that writers should explore contemporary subjects, or is it sort of up to the individual writer?
I think it's whatever you feel strongly about. I mean, I think it's certainly possible to write a great book in kind of a timeless, remote setting that doesn't touch on any of these, modern issues. It just happened to be something that spoke to me because of the world that I live in, and so and I felt like I wasn't seeing many people covering that particular turf, so it
Mhm.
was a fun thing to write about. But but yeah, I think that great books come from all over, and
Yeah.
certainly your books are great, and they are kind of far removed from a lot of modern technology, even though they deal with current social issues often.
Yes, yes. But mine are more in the social issue sort of things. And with each book, I actually think very carefully about what I'm going to deal with social issues, because I think to me that's important. So, so I'm going to ask you just a couple of just off the wall questions before we segue to questions and answers. What is your
Okay.
favorite part about being a writer?
Well, yeah, maybe this is particular to thriller writers, but I love getting that email from a reader or a review on Goodreads or Amazon where they say, I had to stay up all night reading this book or till 3 a.m. I just could not put it down. Damn you, Reece Hirsch. And they're always a little bit annoyed, but happy. and that's I think what a good thriller does. It's just something that you can't put down, that you have to sort of strap in for the ride. And I love that, even if it
Yes,
does cause some readers to lose sleep.
I can imagine how that must be so thrilling because you really do write seat of your pants sorts of things. So what?
And how about you, Terry? What do you like to what makes you write? What do you find most
Well,
gratifying?
I had always wanted to be a writer, and when I hit on my Samuel Craddock as a character, it seemed like it just ran away with me. And every book I just now turned in number 9 to my agent, and I immediately started number 10 because something came to me and I just am so excited about it. And I love that initial excitement about the subject, although my last book, for some reason, I never could quite get it. And finally, I threw out the entire book and started over. And this time I wrote the whole first draft in 2 months because I knew exactly what it needed to be. It was different that I had just not gotten there for whatever reason. And that had never happened to me before. And I thought, okay, I'm done, but I wasn't done. So I really enjoy that initial thrill. And like you, I love it when I get letters. And I don't know if it's people are reading more, but I get an email pretty much every day now saying, when is your next book coming out? I love your work. And, so that's always a thrill. But to me, it's the writing itself that I really love. So, Reece, what's your next project?
Well, I'm well underway with another one, and it is a little bit of a departure for me because I've written 6 books now that all deal heavily to one degree or another with technology, privacy, and cybersecurity. This next one is going to be a little bit more of a psychological suspense novel with
Oh,
more of a traditional murder mystery but it has some unique elements. I don't want to talk too much about it because,
sure.
like you say, you never know when you might chuck it or radically revise it. Everything's still in process right now. But I
Well,
think
good.
it's going to be a little different, little change of pace for me. So that's exciting.
Well, since I think you do characters so well, I'm absolutely confident that you'll be able to do it. So, what I'd like to do now is turn it over to the question and answers um, from people. So, I have 2 questions for you. One of them, Reece, have you ever considered writing in another genre or subgenre? If so, what?
Well, I think this next book is going to be a different subgenre because it's going to be a little psychological suspense. But in my heart of hearts, I grew up loving Ray Bradbury, and I always kind of wanted to write kind of a Ray Bradbury-esque book that has sort of elements of science fiction, elements of fantasy, and that's actually what I first started writing when I was writing my first short stories for the high school literary magazine. They were kind of Ray Bradbury knockoffs, and maybe one day I'll do that. But it's kind of a definite big departure from what I'm doing right now.
Reese, if I could write anything, it would be science fiction. I love science fiction. The first book I ever wrote was a science fiction book. I wrote something called The UFO Conspiracy, and I never even sent it out. It was so much fun to write. Yeah.
Well, maybe before we're done, maybe we'll both get there. And
Wouldn't that be fun?
yeah, it would be. I got to interview Ray Bradbury once when I was running
Really?
my arts and entertainment magazine in Atlanta, and that was a real thrill for me. At least by
Oh,
phone.
that's
I wasn't
fantastic.
sitting across the table from him, but it was great to talk
Lucky
to him.
you, though. Yeah, I envy you that. So here's another question from Robin. Did you do much research into the dark web and how scary is it? And did anything surprise you?
Yes, I did quite a bit of research into the dark web and even downloaded the Tor browser, which is how you access the dark web, and poked around a little bit. But mainly, I read everything that you could read about the true story of Silk Road and Ross Ulbricht. And there's a book called American Kingpin,
Mm.
which I highly recommend, which tells the true story. And that book was really challenging for me because I was so inspired by that true life story that I felt I had to really use it as the jumping off point. So it was really a case where I took something that was real and sort of colored around the edges, added elements, but the essence of it is very similar to the true life story. So I did a lot of research for that one.
Did anything surprise you?
Well, it's true that you can order a hitman on the dark web, or at least, a
Wow.
lot of those websites are scams. But there was an article in Wired magazine about someone who really did order a hit, by reaching out to one of these people on the dark web. So it's a very scary, dark place, and people do things there that they would not do anywhere else. So
Well, thank you, Reece, for telling me that because maybe if this pandemic goes on for another year, I may be hiring a hitman.
there you go.
So, another question from Peggy Lucky. Regarding genre definitions, what to you is the difference between a thriller, a mystery, and other forms of suspense or crime fiction?
Well, I would say a thriller has to have momentum, and it has to be, I think back in the early days of the mystery genre, they referred to it as the novel of sensation. And I think thrillers should be all about immediacy,
Mhm.
things that are happening in the moment, things that are thrilling. But I think that doesn't mean that it has to be shallow. Things that are immediate can be very, deep and meaningful and gripping. But I think that mysteries can be a little bit more of a slow burn, and they don't necessarily have to have that constant momentum or peril that you often find in thrillers. And then you can break it down into all kinds of subgenres today too. But Terry, I'd be interested in hearing what you think about since I'm more on the thriller end of the spectrum, you're more on the mystery end. How would
Well,
you look at it?
what I've heard that makes sense to me is that a thriller is about something that is about to happen that you have to keep from happening or that you know is going to happen and you have to figure out who's going to do it. A mystery is something that has already happened and you're trying to discover who did it.
That's
So
great.
that's a very basic sort of, but then of course you've got things like suspense, which is another outshoot of the thriller, or then you were talking about writing psychological suspense, which is another, it's something that you don't know whether that's really happened or whether it's about to happen, or it involves more character driven emotional sorts of things, I think.
Right. And a lot of the books that I like best blur the lines. They kind of draw from multiple genres and they're hard to pigeonhole. But I think that can make them all the better.
Well, I'm writing something that I've been writing for years now. I keep messing around with, and I can't decide whether it's an adventure story or a mystery. So, eventually I have to figure that out.
Oh, do
Um,
you? Maybe it's both. Maybe it's a little unique.
yeah, maybe. I think I'm going to have to settle into something. Okay, here's another question from Maya. Do you have any advice for new writers regarding self-publishing versus finding an agent? And I think maybe what she's also talking about is self-publishing rather than finding an agent who will put you into the traditional publishing field.
Right. I think that these days there are a lot more different avenues for reaching readers than there were when I started out. Self-publishing, has become a much more, accepted, viable means of reaching readers and even making money as a writer. A lot of writers I know who started out with traditional publishers have reacquired the rights to their books and now publish them online themselves, and some do quite well with it. So there's no one perfect route or no one path, but it is important to make some choices about where you would like to go with your writing career early on, because if you do jump into self-publishing, it can make it a little more challenging to get that big agent interested in you and to go after that debut novel contract with a big traditional publisher. That's not to say that you might not establish a readership through self-publishing and eventually get picked up by a major publishing house, but it's a different path. So you need to think about the choices you're making at the time you're making them, I think. Decide whether you're going to, maybe keep revising that one book or, that book until you've got something that you feel is just, the breakout book for you. Or you can, maybe start down the path of publishing yourself. And that may mean that some things get out into the world that maybe are not quite, that perfect breakout book, the perfect expression of what you can do. But you get your feet wet and you start getting readers and you start learning by doing. So that's not exactly an answer, but there's more than one way to go about it these days.
Well, I would like to suggest also that there are all kinds of programs out there that can help you with this. Like, oh, all kinds of bookstores have or libraries have talks on these kinds of subjects because it's a big subject. I've actually given an hour-long talk at a conference about it. It's really a big decision. There are lots of things to weigh on both sides, and some people make one decision and are very happy with it, and another person will make the opposite decision and are very happy with that. And people move back and forth. There are hybrids. I think if you are writing in a genre like in the mystery field, it would really help you if you were to join an organization like either Sisters in Crime or Mystery Writers of America, because they have a wealth of information and they're always sending out information about someone giving a talk that can really be helpful to you in making those kinds of decisions. So
that's great advice. And then I'd add one organization to that for those who are writing thrillers. There's the International Thriller Writers Association,
yes.
ITW, and they have a conference every July in New York called Thriller Fest, and there's a lot of great information there. There are programs there called Craft Fest, where they teach craft in writing, and Pitch Fest, which teaches or gives you the opportunity to pitch to agents. And that conference is going to be virtual this year, like most of them are.
Yeah, too bad, because I remember going there a few times and really getting a lot out of them. But I think the virtuals will be just as good. So, okay, another question from Robin. Our lives have gone more and more digital. Is there a danger in going all digital? Should we retain analog records and the like? Say if the Russians came in and destroyed all of our financial records, then what?
Well, that's a good question. And, it's true that we have gone digital. Most records are kept that way. But it sometimes pays to be a little bit of a Luddite because, it turns out that paper records are actually pretty secure. You're not going to have a cyber criminal come in and hack them and steal them. They have to, break into your house to do that and get into your file cabinet. And, there's some merit to keeping some things paper.
Okay, I'll give you a very good example of that. I was getting a master's degree at San Francisco State, and I went in and I said, I'm applying for my degree because I've done the whole thing. And she said, I can't find any of your files. She said, they're missing. And I said, that's okay. I have all of them. I kept every piece of paper I ever got. So yes, you can keep everything. I remember once reading a science fiction story in which some people discovered a treasure trove. This is far in the future, and they discovered a treasure trove, and they were so excited because someone had actually figured out how to add and subtract using numbers instead of having to use a computer. They were excited because you could do it on paper all by yourself. So yeah, we have some danger of losing things. Okay, so are there any more questions? We'll be happy to take more questions, and otherwise we're going to wrap this up pretty soon. So it looks like that's the end of the questions. Reece, let me just ask you one more question. Who are some of your favorite thriller writers?
Well, I'll broaden it out, and you're a favorite of mine. I think your
Thank
books
you.
are wonderful. And I tend to read a lot of. I enjoy crime fiction too because I think that, like with your books, those are kind of in some ways the social novels of our time. And they're also great reads. But I like people like Kate Atkinson and Don Winslow. And
Don Winslow writes a really, really good book, doesn't he?
Oh, he does. He's so good. The Border trilogy or Power of the Dog trilogy is just an amazing chronicle of the drug wars.
It's
and a personal favorite of mine is the Dawn Patrol, which is it's a little comic, but it's also kind of a gritty private eye kind of book. And it's all set in kind of the surfing community of Southern California.
I know, I love it.
It's so much fun.
Although my favorite of his books is one that most people have never heard of. It's called California Fire and Life. And I think of it almost as a long poem. It is just the most amazing, the language in it. It's a wonderful book. I just enjoyed it enormously.
Okay, that's going on my list. And,
yeah.
and
if
Dennis
you haven't
Lehane.
read, oh yes, Dennis Lehane. How about Meg Abbott? She writes a very good thriller, very good, crisp thriller. The last one was almost too technical for me. It was really, but it's fun to read her. Yeah.
Right, I love her work, and she has this sort of subgenre where she goes into a sort of a very particular world and takes you into it, and then there's a murder, but she immerses you in whether it's high school ballerinas or gymnasts or a laboratory, but or high school cheerleaders, but it takes you into a whole little subculture and sort of immerses you in it. So she's a great writer. And some recent ones too. Steph Cha, who wrote Your House Must Pay. I thought that was a great book.
Yeah.
And also Blacktop Wasteland by Sean Cosby.
That's one of the great books of the decade, I think. It was just amazing.
And Lou Berney. Lou Berney is awesome.
Lou Berney is awesome. Yeah, November Road. I can't wait for him to come out with another book. Yeah. Okay, so we have another question from someone, Kim. Reece, was Lisa or Chris, your protagonist, based in any way on a real person you've met?
Well, in a sense that Chris Bruin, did get the inspiration for him came from, one of my colleagues at a former firm who was a former Department of Justice cyber crimes prosecutor, who was then in private practice like I am. And so as far as the job, it came from a particular individual. But then with the character, it's funny how you build them up. You take certain characteristics from one person, characteristics from another, and at first you're kind of saying, well, mixing the chemicals. Well, how does this work? What would this person be like? And then hopefully, if things are going well in the writing, it stops being just this collection of attributes, and it just starts to gel. And you start to, there's a character on the page who's talking in a way that's unique. And so, hopefully, I've done that with both of my protagonists. But at least you have to reach a point in your writing where you feel that's happening, or else you're just not, getting where you need to go.
I think that's what I was talking about earlier when I was saying I enjoy the writing part of it, is that there's that moment when suddenly you realize, and this has happened to me more than once, that where you suddenly say, oh, I can't wait, you wait to get back to the book I'm reading, you realize, no, it's the book I'm writing.
Right. And in my first book, The Insider, there's a character, Will Connolly, which I've got to admit is patterned a little bit after me, as I was an associate coming up in a big law firm. And I sort of took it as a challenge because, lawyers are not the most well-liked people in the real world. And so I wanted to show, a young lawyer coming up who's, just as hard-edged, just as ambitious, as a lot of the people I know in law firms. And yet, you may not like him at first, but I hope that by the end of the book, you start to like him a little bit. And that was sort of my challenge for that character, is to really show a tough, ambitious character, but sort of get you on his side.
Well, lawyers may think that they're not well liked, but if you're in big trouble, who are you going to call? Are you going to call your Aunt Jane, or are you going to call a lawyer? So,
True.
Okay, well, I think we're about done and ready to turn things back over to Greg. I want to thank everybody for coming. And if you have any questions, Reece, would you like to give anybody a place where they can reach you? Do you have a website where they can?
I do. It's reecehirsch.com, ReeceHirsch.com. And I've got my email address there and more information about the books. And, I love to hear from readers. So drop me a line.
And you can reach me at terryshames.com and find out anything and sign up for my newsletter, which I don't bombard you with very often. So that's it. Greg, thank you very much. And we're turning this over to you now.
Well, Reece and Terry, thank you very much for a very entertaining and informational show that was a little scary. I also want to give special thanks to the Simpson family, our presenting sponsor, and thanks to all of you for joining us tonight. As I said before, if you enjoyed tonight's program and look forward to more, we invite you to make a gift to the Library Foundation. Click the donate button on our website at wclibrary.org or in the chat box. Your gift really does make a difference. We hope you'll join us next month for Live from the Library, titled California of Peril and Stewardship, on March 17th with author Obi Kaufman. Obi will explore the transformation of California's resource landscape from its ancient origins through its modern challenges to its future possibilities. More information and the registration link can be found at our website. Thank you all again for attending, and good night.